This is a double-linked identification. Mom in the box and the Monterey Jane Doe, identified as Linda Ray Jacobs and Ida Florence Jacobs. This story starts out in Monterey, California, in February of 2014. It was then that the police received a call to the 1100 block of 4th Street. They would tentatively identify her thanks to the California state driver's license that she was carrying, stating her name was Francesca Linda Jacobs, listing her birth date as 1955. It was determined the COD was starvation. They stated that no foul play was suspected at all. But then as they began digging into this case, they realized that inside of a box in her house, under her kitchen table, was the remains of somebody else. The woman was fully clothed, and she'd clearly been inside that box for years. No COD could even be determined, so of course foul play couldn't be ruled out. And obviously it's not normal to keep a person in a box under your table. Hence the nickname, in her case, as Mom in the Box. Questions began to arise involving Francesca Jacobs. So according to her driver's license, she was 58, but she appeared to be far older than that age. So they started to trace her life, and they would determine that there's almost no records at all of her living it. They knew she lived in the Monterey Peninsula dating back to about the 1990s. They would try to find proof of her, and it was more important than just figuring out who she was. They were trying to figure out who the woman in the box was. Every step they took just raised more questions. It was one of those mysteries that only DNA can answer. So then, of course, enter Othram Labs. In this case, the expensive testing that was needed was covered by Roads to Justice, and they would fund this. As they began sifting through matches, they were led to the former husband of our Jane Doe. He would let them know while her name was not actually Francesca Jacobs, it was pretty close. The woman was in fact Linda Ray Jacobs. Now remember, she said she was born in 1955 but looks older. And it would turn out that she had shaved 13 years off her age. She was actually born in 1942. The DNA would also match hers, so the mom in the box was actually her mother, and they would determine her name was Ida Florence Jacobs. Ida and Linda were actually a really close mother and daughter team for a very long time, and no one really knows how it all fell apart or what led to her using a false name, or why she chose to keep her mother where she was. The entire story is pretty bizarre. Linda Jacobs had a difficult life. She fell in her carport, breaking her leg, and found herself laying there in pain for quite a while. And in that instance, her calls for help weren't heard by anybody. Eventually she was found, and some people around the community would try to help her. A neighborhood boy would take her garbage out once a week. Unfortunately, she had no insurance, and she felt she couldn't get medical help. As a result, her health began to decline. She found herself suffering in silence, home alone, unable to work or make any sort of money. She was considered a little bit of a cranky neighbor. As a result, people weren't particularly falling over themselves to help her, which made it harder, and likely made her crankier, which is pretty understandable. She had to be feeling pretty desperate at the time. So she would eventually find herself living alone in the apartment she'd lived in for 12 years, with only her cats for company. Her landlord would try to get in to check out the house, and she wouldn't let him in. If anything in her home broke, her landlord would have to just leave the part at the door, and she would fix it herself. She allowed nobody past the threshold of her doorway. We know, though, that before all of this happened, Linda was actually a pretty prominent real estate agent, and she had worked her way up and was selling pretty high-end homes. One of those people she sold a home to was the landlord of the apartment she was living in. As her health declined, she had to stop selling homes. By 2002, she wasn't working anymore at all. It didn't help that during this time, a friend would say that she fell down and hurt her shoulder also, in addition to breaking her leg. Between the two accidents, she was in constant pain, and that probably lent itself to part of why she had what was considered a grouchy personality. Money was tight, and her circumstances were pretty sad. A neighborhood teen would bring her fountain drinks, which was her only luxury. It appears she was emaciated and weak already by this time, but she didn't ask anyone for help, other than that plea for fountain drinks. After accepting the final fountain drink that the neighbor brought her, she didn't even shut the door. She apparently stumbled back, landing on her couch one final time. She was found after a day, and that was because a welfare check was called in by one of the neighbors because the door had stayed open. Likely no one went in themselves because she didn't allow anyone in her house. What was found was described as a disturbing scene. She was wearing a velour pantsuit with glasses full of urine all over the house. The house itself was described as a hoarding situation. More about this is described in an article I found about this case, and it's linked below. You can see her apartment here as it appears on Zillow. She had a 2-bedroom, 600 square foot apartment, so it was pretty small with one bathroom. And then, of course, it leaves us to Ida, who was found inside the box. Her remains were described as mummified. They had been wrapped in plastic and placed inside of a wooden crate that was wrapped again in plastic, and then hidden inside of a cardboard box. She had likely been in that box for at least 20 years. It does not say if she was collecting Social Security for her mother. That would probably explain it, but that isn't mentioned here at all, which makes me think that probably wasn't the case. The strange thing didn't stop there. She had no pots and pans or any dishes at all. In fact, she had no food at all in her kitchen, not even a can. The refrigerator and freezer were completely empty. She had a coffee maker, but it hadn't been used in a long time. A neighbor of hers would not only bring her fountain pot, but would sometimes bring her enchiladas or pasta, and it appears that was all that she'd been eating. Linda was pretty ready for her own demise. She had removed the few photos that she had and wrapped them in plastic. She had one purse that had an ID card in it, identifying her under that fake name. She had included a handwritten poem that was titled Safely Home and was about being at home in heaven. She had a handwritten will and gave all of her property to her landlord. By this time, her rent was months behind, and she left jewelry items to cover that cost. She also had left a note saying that her mother, Florence Ida Jacobs, was in the dining room, but it didn't say why. Terry, who was a neighbor who had been the one giving her leftover food sometimes and bringing her fountain drinks, would say that she was able to share that Linda had a pain medication problem, but also a love of her cats, and had been feeding a cat that had been found in the complex that everybody had named Pest. Linda had told Terry that Pest had saved her life when he showed up because she was ready to pass away, and he gave her a renewed desire to live. Linda would take her walker outside and go on short walks with the cat. But then Pest got sick and passed away, and it was at this point that Linda's physical and mental health began to decline more and more. Terry would say that she always believed that Linda had money, and it appeared Linda had been selling off a lot of jewelry and items. But of course we know she had items left because she left them to her landlord. But no one knows for sure why she had a fake name. She had been working, and normally one could apply for SSDI, if unable to work, of course. But because she was so committed to the fake name, I guess, and her work history, I'm not sure how that worked. She had to have given some sort of a social security number. So while it's all strange, they found out that Linda had been married at one point, and she had been living with her mother and her husband in Monterey. But she eventually divorced him, and he would take to walking past her home with his new significant other, apparently angry that she was still in the home that they used to share together. She would describe this as being mentally abusive and causing her to break down, sharing that information with her landlord. Her landlord noted that at one point, if anyone brought up her mother, she would get very angry, so nobody really knew what happened to Ida. As Linda's health declined, she would call her landlord at all times of the day or night, constantly worried about her health. This is generally considered to fit into OCD, as would the hoarding of urine in cups or hoarding of other items. Linda also began having panic attacks. Her landlord was really kind and understanding. She even gave her $4,000 at one point to help out with bills. It ran out eventually, obviously, but Linda didn't ask her for any more help. And in fact, at some point, her landlord offered to help more, but Linda declined. In the end, Linda only weighed 65 pounds when she was found. The question of why her mom was in that box has never been solved. The police would say there's no indication that Linda hurt her mother, and it's possible that she was a sad, lonely woman who kept her mother there because she wanted her near. Linda and Ida Jacobs went unidentified for 9 years. Had Linda lived, she would be 81 years old today. Thank you everyone so much for watching and listening. If you aren't subscribed, please take a moment to do so. hitting the bell so you are notified of new videos. And thank you all for leaving comments and emojis to help with engagement. It all pushes the channel to get suggested to new people, and I appreciate that so much. Take care of yourselves and each other.